Hey everybody, it's Drew from 198 Methods. Thought we'd just do a quick video explainer about today's post and action, which is about the EPA's power plant rules that are due for comments on August 8th. So here we go. We'll start off with just a little context so folks understand this is all coming out of what's been a long-term project to try and regulate global warming pollution from the electric power sector, power plants that burn fossil fuels here in the US. Started way back in 2015. The Obama administration then had just signed on to the Paris Climate Agreement, and what was then called the Clean Power Plan was their first and best plan for how to regulate global warming pollution from power plants. And the goal of that plan was to cut pollution 30% roughly by the year 2030. So things have changed a lot since then, and a lot of things have gotten better. The Biden administration's proposed rule is to cut pollution 90 to 100% by 2035, but it has a couple of loopholes and some things that phase in. And these are new rules. Obama's Clean Power Plan, of course, was sued by a bunch of different states that produce oil, coal, and gas, which claimed that the federal government was discriminating against their states because the Clean Power Plan required power plants not to burn oil, coal, or gas, fossil fuels, because that would contribute to pollution, including global warming pollution. So an important piece of context for this is the new rules that EPA has put out cannot and will not say anything about what fuel you're allowed to put into the power plant. They just regulate how much pollution comes out of the smokestack of the power plant. So it's about outputs, not inputs. And it very specifically does not say you have to build solar instead of fossil fuels. It just says if you produce power, electric power as part of it, here are the pollution emission requirements you have to meet as a power plant or as a utility that owns a power plant or whatever. So the good news is, like I said, these are definitely a step in the right direction. And as proposed, they would cut pollution from the electric power sector by between 90 and 100% when fully enacted. But as we'll talk about in just a second, there's a couple of loopholes, which mean they probably won't get to the actual goal of cutting pollution 100%. This is what Joe Biden promised, was to eliminate global warming pollution from the electric sector by the year 2035. And this is all as part of President Biden's ongoing commitment to cut US global warming pollution in half, 50% reduction by the year 2030. So to get to those goals, you have to eliminate a lot of the pollution that comes from the power sector. You have to do that, one, because the electric power sector is one of the leading sources of global warming pollution in the US. And two, as we decarbonize other sectors, places like people switching to electric cars, for example, instead of gasoline-powered cars, or switching to electric heat pumps instead of using fuel oil or natural gas to heat their homes, that's going to create more demand for electricity, right? Those are electric appliances instead of fossil fuel-powered appliances and cars and things like that. And so you're creating more demand for electricity. At the same time, you're trying to reduce the pollution really dramatically from the electric sector itself. So get a lot more power from clean sources, a lot less power from dirty sources, and do it while making a lot more things run on electricity, and all in the next 7 to 10 years, basically. So what's in the EPA's power plant rules are this big reduction in greenhouse gas emissions and other kinds of pollution. It covers not just carbon pollution or greenhouse gas pollution, but also smog forming pollution and other stuff. But historically, the problem with these kind of plans is they lean really heavily. The Obama era plan leaned really heavily on gas, and the Biden administration's plan is also going to create a bunch of incentives, and including some perverse incentives we'll talk about in a second, for switching over to gas. And it's not doing enough to actually compel people to not build new gas-fired power plants, again, because they're trying to remain neutral about the fuel that goes into the power plant, just say you can't have pollution coming out of it. And so that's creating some opportunities for bad actors, essentially. So 3 big changes we want to see in the draft rules, and got to get your comments in by August 8 on this round. The first one has to do with speed. And so one is the way that the rules are drafted, they give power plants a bunch of opportunities to opt out of the rules or go slower. Most of the new pollution reduction rules in this EPA rule don't take effect until the year 2030, which again is like right up against the Biden administration's goal of cutting global warming pollution in half. Doesn't give us a lot of time to decarbonize the electric sector. And there are a bunch of exemptions where if you're going to, for example, close the power plant by 2040, you don't even have to reduce pollution by 2030. You can just run it full pollution tilt all the way until 2040 and then turn it off in theory. That would be allowable under these standards. Also, lots of ways where people can get extensions because they're working on reducing pollution from the power plant, but they haven't finished installing the technology to do it. And so that creates more delay in the process. The last thing we'll say is that EPA really, they've been slow walking the creation of this rule. We've been pushing them to put these new rules out for more than a year now. And one of the reasons why is they have to get this stuff finalized before 2024, before the end of 2024, I should say, or else it's possible for Congress to use something called the Congressional Review Act to essentially pull back in administration rules that are promulgated right before a presidential election. So if they wait too long to get these rules finalized and out the door, there's a chance that the Congress will actually roll them back. And just this week, a large group of Republican, mostly senators from fossil fuel producing states sent a letter to the EPA asking them to withdraw the rule and essentially saying, if you don't go faster or start over, then we will make you take the rule back. We will use the Congressional Rule Act. So they're foreshadowing that as a strategy coming soon. Second thing, we mentioned this before, too much reliance on natural gas, and essentially the rules give a huge pass to a lot of natural gas power plants as currently constructed in the US. Most natural gas power plants, and especially the newer ones that are being proposed, we've talked before about plans in North Carolina by Duke Energy or in Michigan by DTE Energy, that were responding to the Inflation Reduction Act by proposing a lot of new, small natural gas plants. These things are usually right around 100 megawatts of generating capacity. And so that's why we're saying that the rules should be written to cover plants that are between 85 and 100 megawatts of generating capacity. Right now, the rules as written only apply to power plants with 300 megawatts of generating capacity. So really big, what we sometimes call base load plants. So if you think about a traditional fossil fuel power plant, right, it's a really big facility. It runs 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, and it's sort of always on producing power. Most of the natural gas power plants that are being built and proposed right now are much smaller than that. They're around 100 megawatts or even a little bit smaller, and they're not intended to run 24 hours a day or every day of the year. They only turn them on. They're called peaker plants. They only turn on when the electricity demand peaks, like when everybody's air conditioner is turned on in mid-afternoon in the Southwest. You would turn on a bunch of these gas power plants. As written right now, the EPA rules wouldn't apply to those smaller and peaker gas plants. It would only apply to really big coal-fired baseload plants. And so we need to get that minimum requirement down so that more places are covered by the new EPA rules. And the third thing, which you've heard us talk a lot about with the Inflation Reduction Act and the infrastructure law and things like that, is this reliance on false solutions. The Biden administration and the Department of Energy really like things like hydrogen fuel. There's a whole initiative around creating these things called hydrogen hubs, which are essentially very heavily industrialized zones where they would produce hydrogen as a fuel. And one of the reasons why those things are looking economically attractive right now to a bunch of fossil fuel companies is that the EPA's power plant rules would give you special incentives and breaks on meeting the requirements to reduce pollution if you use hydrogen as all or part of the fuel in your power plant. Similarly, carbon capture and sequestration, or CCS, this is one of those ideas that people have been toying with for decades. It's never really worked. It's like clean coal. It's basically a way for coal and other fossil fuel power plants to say that they are reducing pollution, but it's never worked, and it's certainly never been economically viable. It's just much cheaper to produce electricity with a solar panel or a wind turbine than it is to put carbon capture technology on top of a power plant. But because there are all these incentives in the Inflation Reduction Act and the infrastructure law to build carbon capture technology, we've seen a bunch of those utilities, again, the same ones that are responsible for most of the fossil fuel pollution and most of the air pollution in environmental justice communities, companies like Duke, Dominion, DTE Energy, SoCal Power, all those kind of folks are lining up to propose new gas-powered power plants, gas-fired power plants with carbon capture attached. Nobody's been able to figure out how to make it work, but they don't have to under the EPA's current rules. They just have to say they're gonna figure out how to make it work by 2035, and then they can go ahead and build new gas-fired power plants. And if they don't figure out how to make it work, if it never actually works, they can pass the cost of that on to the utility customers. So you get both higher rates and more pollution. And then if the plants aren't able to be made to comply with the power plant rules by 2035, you'd be stuck in a pickle where essentially you had to either shut off the power plants indefinitely and possibly not have enough electricity supply to meet demand, or have to pay the utility companies a ton more money to figure out how to make the carbon capture thing work, even though it never has. Two other things that they can do in addition to just eliminating the hydrogen and CCS subsidies in the power plant rule, two other things they can do to help with this. One, most of these smaller gas-fired power plants and the ones that are being proposed to have CCS attached are in frontline environmental justice communities. So making sure that you have really strict new rules so that environmental justice communities get what we call not just consultation, but consent, so that communities actually get to have binding votes on whether or not they want to allow new power plants to be built in their community, whether or not they want to allow some of these technologies like carbon capture, which may reduce carbon pollution, but may increase other kinds of pollution like ammonia, which is really toxic to human health. So the communities will get a chance to vote on that and have air monitoring and considerations of whether or not that's something they want. And then also requiring these binding, what are called community benefit agreements. It's kind of a legalistic term of art from the utility sector, but CBAs can be a powerful tool where basically a local community can say, if you want to build a new peaker power plant in our community, you have to invest money in our local community. You have to help us build a new school, or you have to guarantee that half of the workers in the plant or during the construction phase will come from our local community, not be bussed in from elsewhere. So those kind of community benefit agreements are really important. It can be helpful in helping communities get control of these projects so that they're not just being used as a dumping ground for new power generation facilities, but they're actually getting some benefits in terms of jobs or economic development, and that they can create rules around if the pollution, if the power plant pollutes too much or more than it says it will, that they can then force the power plant to shut off or pay additional damages to the local community. Those are important things that can be written into a community benefit agreement and are binding contracts, so the company can't kind of wiggle out of them, just make a promise, like we promise to get to net zero by 2050, but then if they don't do it, nothing actually happens. CBAs are a more effective way to hold them to those commitments. So that's our three quick things we want you to send a comment to the EPA and CC the Biden administration about. Deadline for comments is August 8th, so use the page linked in the blog post or in the email, and we'll have more details about how to do that. You can write your own letter, or we'll have some sample talking points, but make sure to get your comments in by August 8th, that's next Tuesday, so that they can get filed in time for this next deadline. Thanks.